In September of 1946, the U.S. Army transport ship Brigadier General M.G. Zalinksi was making its way from Bangor, Washington to Alaska, carrying 700 tons of Bunker C oil, gasoline, aerial bombs, and ammunition. After traveling over 500 miles without radar, the Zalinski ran aground off the rocky coast of northern British Columbia. There, the ship remained in the Grenville Channel about 100 kilometers south of Prince Rupert, lodged upside down in 34 meters of water, slowly deteriorating for many years, like a ticking time bomb waiting to wreak havoc on the local habitat.
There was absolutely nothing forgiving there. She glanced off a solid rock wall, tore open some tanks and a forward hatch, began taking on water. Captain immediately had him sound to see how she was doing, and she ended up realizing very quickly that she was not going to survive, and swung out the boats and got his crew off. They pulled away, in the boats in the dark, probably lost sight of the Zalinski very quickly, and nobody ever saw her again.
Throughout those years that the Zalinski lay in the channel in the middle of what the First Nations call the Great Bear Rainforest, its deterioration began causing various oil leakages.
It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever worked. The constant clouds swirling around amongst the trees and through the mountains and up and down the channels. The divers commented when they got down on the wreck how it was one of the most beautiful diving jobs they'd ever been on, because it's beautiful clear water and all this life around us.
These leakages threaten the local environment, which is home to many unique and vital species, including whales and a keystone salmon species which generally sustains grizzly bears, black bears, coastal gray wolves, and the elusive spirit bear, a unique subspecies of black bear which features a white-colored coat and is highly regarded by both First Nations groups as well as the British Columbian government, who named the spirit bear British Columbia's official animal. As early as the 1990s, the Canadian Coast Guard received sporadic reports of oil in the water of the southern Grenville Channel. While authorities were suspicious that it could have come from the long-lost Zalinski, they couldn't be sure of the oil's origin until she was discovered in 2003 by the Canadian Coast Guard, almost 60 years after she first ran aground.
When they started getting these reports and thought, well, it sounds like we've got a leaking wreck, but we don't know what it is. And so he started doing research, and in his short list was the Zalinski. And it wasn't until they got Navy divers on the wreck and actually recovered the bell that they established that it was the Zalinski, although ironically the bell didn't say Zalinski, the bell said Lake Frona, which was the original name.
While the Canadian Coast Guard monitored the vessel, taking measures to conduct constant emergency repairs to prevent the leakage of oil, it was determined that a significant operation should be undertaken to remove the remaining oil from the vessel and prevent the further exposure of marine pollutants to the environment.
They harvest seafood, so you can imagine what the impact would be of oil pollution on oysters and mussels and fish in that area. So they had a very high interest in preserving their territory and to make sure that there would not be any future consequences to that.
Working with the Canadian Coast Guard, along with feedback from local First Nations groups, Mammoet Salvage Americas was granted the contract in 2013 to remove the ship's remaining fuel from the wreck, using a process known as hot tapping.
Several years passed with repeated leaks, and they would take local divers down and basically use underwater epoxy to plug the leaks. Because of the way riveting is done, the rivets end up with a little different composition in the hull, and they were rotting faster than the plating was. And so the rivets were what were leaking oil. So they'd go down and plug these with underwater epoxy, but underwater epoxy proved to not be very effective, and they would start leaking again. So finally the decision was taken to just get the oil out of there.
Of course, we did the survey already for the Canadian Coast Guard. After that, there became a public tender, and we put in a proposal, and that proposal was valued as the best and the most cost-effective one. Let's say 90% of all our assets were Canadian, so all the money that they spent on us actually was used to engage local resources.
The minute we showed up there, I looked around and said, well, it's not hard to come up with a reason to take the oil out of this wreck. This is an area worth protecting at almost any cost.
Hot tapping is a procedure where holes are drilled into a tank which contains fluids or gases, making a connection that does not interrupt or empty that tank. In doing so, the team is able to pump in clean water and flush out the contaminants without allowing any fluids to leak into the environment. However, in order to do this, first, naval architect Hans Schiet had to locate where the oil was stored within the ship, which proved to be no easy task. Although the naval architect had access to drawings of the ship as it was originally built, those drawings were designed for a coal-fired steamship rather than an oil ship, which the Zalinski was converted to at an unknown time between her manufacture in 1919 and her purchase by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps in 1941.
Zalinski was not an oil-fired ship. She was designed to burn coal. And for many years she ran on coal. She was a steamship. And it was the Navy that converted her to oil, but we had no drawings for how they converted her.
Using his experience, the naval architect made conclusions about how that conversion was made, where the oil might be stored, and drew up a plan to test drill for the oil.
It was basically Hans sitting there staring at it thinking, as a marine architect, as somebody who designed vessels, think, if I were going to convert this ship, how would I do it?
While many of the naval architect's predictions were accurate, initial drilling revealed oil in other locations as well, prompting Global Diving, Mammoet's dive contractors on the project, to probe further into the wreckage using a video ray, a small inspection ROV. Unfortunately, a 2.5-meter giant Pacific octopus was as interested in the video ray as the dive team was in locating the ship, and the octopus captured the ROV, hauling it to the furthest corners of the hull.
I was talking to one of the divers, a guy named Alan Deaver, and he said, I had an encounter with the octopus days ago. And I said, really? Tell me about this. And he just sort of came up and climbed right up on him, wrapped itself around him. He said it was tentacles. It was feeling at the controls on his helmet and checking him out. And I said, well, Alan, so what'd you do? He says, well, I'd like to play with him, but they pay me to work. So I sort of had to peel him off and kind of push him off to the side. And it was just another kind of friendly, sentient being down there who was watching what we were doing and curious about everything.
Serendipitously, recovery efforts led to the discovery that the tank top of the fuel tanks of Zalinski had completely wasted away. The distinct tanks which Schiet believed would be part of the plan for removing the oil were gone, and the bunker fuel which was left was migrating freely into the highest points of the upturned hull.
Originally we had anticipated that we could circulate hot water over the tanks, but now with the top of the tank missing, we couldn't do that. So we had to change our method during the operation.
Based upon this discovery, the naval architect altered the drilling plan. Test drilling revealed that oil had migrated into many unexpected areas and spread throughout the hull. At this point, Mammoet and Global Diving began hot tapping the hull in multiple locations, with the Coast Guard and Western Canada Marine Response Corporation on hand in case of a spill.
Twice a day we had video conferencing with all these different parties across Canada. So Ottawa was kept to speed through live video links, same as an incident command center in Prince Rupert. We had one man there constantly engaged in informing all the various people from the Coast Guard.
The process of mapping the proper hot tap locations and installing the connections was the most time-consuming. And once these were in place, the Mammoet and Global Diving team pumped each hot tap point until the oil was mostly flushed out. Then they did a second round, ensuring the visible pump returns showed only trace amounts of oil. When the hot tapping was complete, the oil that was recovered was pumped into large tanks and brought to a cleaning company who separated and recycled the oil from the water and cleaned the tanks. Due to the extreme deterioration of the bulkheads, it was clear that more oil may have been present in pockets scattered throughout the wreck. So Mammoet left the hot tap valves in place so that these sites could be revisited and pumped after more oil could accumulate in those high points.
In this way, in the future, if you do that on a yearly or 2-yearly basis, you can go back and very easily make a hose connection and drain off any other oil that possibly could end up there.
Understanding the impact that the Zalinksi wreckage had on the local environment and native inhabitants, Roger Girouard, the Canadian Coast Guard's Assistant Commissioner for the Western Region, brought representatives from the First Nations, including members of the Gitgat and Gitxaala bands, to experience the operation firsthand and see the improvement that had been made to restore the Great Bear Rainforest to its natural condition.
We have the responsibilities under various legislations to look at the oceans and pollution issues.
The Canadian Coast Guard set up a unified command system. And in the unified command, the First Nation groups, they were represented. They were kept completely up to speed with what was happening on a daily basis, and they could participate in the decision making on what steps to take.
Despite difficult conditions, the pollution risk was removed thanks to Mammoet's efforts.
The nice thing about this project is a good example of what we do. We solve problems for governments around the world. We advise governments in solving these complex problems, and that goes from the technical part and the operational part, but also we assist them in dealing with the political part of it.
The entire project was done safely, a fact that Mammoet Salvage, the Canadian Coast Guard, the First Nations, and the marine life of the Grenville Channel can all appreciate.
I also developed a pretty close relationship with Roger Girouard, who is the Assistant Commissioner for the Western Region. One of the first statements he made to us was, he said, nobody was hurt the night the Zalinski sank, and nobody's going to be hurt getting the oil off it. And you know, that was my philosophy before I heard it from him, but it was very nice to hear that they felt that way too.